Hey, what's up? Hello. If you're new here, my name is Kayla and you are watching Kayla's Bookish Vibes. Today's video is going to be the rest of the books that I read for 2024 that I consider like some of my favorites. So if you watched my last video, it was my top 5 romances of 2024. And I wanted to do my top 5 books of each genre. So I wanted to do my top 5 of thriller, my top 5 of fantasy. However, I didn't have 5 books in any of the other genres to do a top 5. So I decided to just lump them all together and we'll just do one more video of my tops for the year. And I'll also be letting you guys know what my favorite book of 2024 was. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm quite out of breath because I had to dig some of these books out. And some of the books I still couldn't find. And I was like, look, it's either spend the energy trying to find these books or spend the energy filming the video. And the video won. So let's go ahead and get started. My first genre that I'm going to go, again, I don't have 5 for any of the genres, but for my first genre, we're going to do historical fiction. You guys know historical fiction is literally my favorite genre. And so it's really hard to impress me in that genre. I feel like I've read so much historical fiction and I'm just like a history buff, you know, in my own time. So it's really hard, I think, to impress me in that genre. But I do have 2 books that I considered my favorites of the year, and one of them was actually a reread. So the first one we're gonna go with is Family by J. California Cooper. I loved this book. I ended up giving it 5 stars, which again, it is very hard for me to give a historical fiction 5 stars. A lot of them end up just getting like 4 stars from me or like 3.5, but Family by J. California Cooper, 5 stars. And I can't wait to read more by this author. I'll have to put the book on the screen because I actually don't own it, which reminds me I need to go ahead and order it because I need to have this on my shelf. I've never read anything by J. California Cooper, but she comes highly recommended by one of my favorite booktubers. So when I saw it in Barnes & Noble randomly, just perusing the aisles, I picked it up and I absolutely loved it. It was the perfect book at the perfect time. It's not long at all, but it's very impactful and I really enjoyed that book. So 5 stars. And then the next one, I ended up giving 4.5 stars. The first time I read this book, I actually gave it 5 stars. And then I reread it because I couldn't remember why I loved this book so much. I read this book years ago and I couldn't remember what was so special about this book. Like, why was I so obsessed with it? So I decided to reread it this year. And that book is The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I ended up giving it 4.5 on my reread. Honestly, I think I just want to round that book up to a 5. I loved the book the first time I read it. I remember being obsessed with that book the first time I read it. I just couldn't remember why. And after rereading it, I realized why I loved that book so much. Our male main character in that book is just so brilliant. He's so smart. And he obviously, it's a slave narrative, so he had to overcome a lot in that book. But just the way that Ta-Nehisi wrote that book, I could tell that was my first book by that author as well. But I could just tell that was a very intelligent man, and I was absolutely right on that assumption after reading that book. So loved it, 4.5, an all-time fave for my historical fiction. Those were the only 2 historical fiction books that were like strictly historical fiction. They didn't like cross over into any other genres that I absolutely loved for 2024. So our next genre we're going to be getting into is our thrillers. So I have a few thrillers. I think I only have 3. And I think thrillers is another one of those genres that I'm just really picky about when I'm considering it like my favorite thriller. But I did have a few. The first one is Allegedly by Tiffany D Jackson. I read this book for the first time. I read this author for the first time this year. I did like an author taste test with Tiffany D Jackson and she quickly became an author for me, but this was probably my favorite book that I read out of all of them. This is more of like a psychological thriller and I think I really enjoyed it because it's YA, but it doesn't necessarily read as YA. I think young adults will really enjoy this novel, but adults will also enjoy it just as much. The ending really got me and I absolutely loved this book. Highly recommend. I believe I gave this 4.5 stars. The next book I have in our thriller category is Not So Perfect Strangers by Stratton. I did an author taste test with this author as well. I loved both of her books that I read, but this one was by far my favorite. I loved the exploration of our, I guess, villain in the story, and I love the fact that we got the villain's backstory. We got her origin story of why she is the way that she is, and she was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. So I absolutely enjoyed this book. Highly recommend this one, and I gave this one 4.5 stars. And the last one is literally a book that I just finished, and that is Model Home by River Solomon. It took me a while to read this book because it is so eerie. It is so eerie and it is so dark and heavy that because I'm a mood reader, I had to put it away because it was dampening my mood. And I didn't want that. I didn't want to be in that mindset or in that mood at the time. But once I finished reading all of my books for the year, I was like, let me go back to this book because I love River Solomon's writing style. In fact, there is another book by this author on my list, but I love their writing style, the way that they write. It's not something, you can't always take it at face value. Sometimes you do have to dig a little deeper, and I enjoy reading books like that, you know, here and there, not all the time. Sometimes I just want like a very straightforward book, but River Solomon is going to make you think, they're going to make you reflect, and I absolutely love this book. This is a dark book. It is very dark. I think I haven't filmed it yet, but I'll be going over my thoughts and feelings about this book in a vlog. So keep a lookout for that if you want to know like a synopsis of this book and my further feelings on it. But this was definitely a 4.5. I want to give it a 5, and I think I should give it a 5 just because it was very obvious that the purpose of this book was to make you feel the things that it was making you feel, and it accomplished that. I just don't like the feelings that it made me feel, but that's just like a personal thing, you know? So I think I'm gonna bump this up to a 5 because the whole point of this book is to make you feel heavy. There are some like very heavy themes. It's dark. There's like so many things being explored in this book, and I felt everything that the author wanted me to feel, which is the purpose of the book. It absolutely nailed the purpose. Like, so I'm gonna bump this up to a 5. Absolutely, I don't even want to say loved this book. I enjoyed reading this. Did I enjoy it? There was no joy. I don't know how to explain it. This was a well-written book, and River Solomon is an extremely talented writer. I just don't have the words to explain how this book made me feel or how to describe it. 5 out of 5. Those were all the thrillers. So I only had 3 thrillers that I considered my favorites of 2024. The next genre we're going to get into is fantasy. I did have a few fantasy. The first one I'm going to start with is When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker. I remember when this book was like making its rounds on Book Talk and here on BookTube, and I was really like in my romantasy bag. Like I was really getting into romantasy for some reason. And I picked this one up because a few of the booktubers that I watch really loved this book, and I'm so glad that I did. I absolutely loved the writing style of this book. It was very floral in some parts, super descriptive, but like in a beautiful way. And then there were other parts where it was just like kind of straightforward. I really enjoyed our female main character in this book, and I can't wait to read the next one. I ended up giving this one 5 stars, and I'm pretty sure I did a reading vlog on this book as well. So I will leave all the reading vlogs that I've done if you want to know more about the synopsis or more about my feelings for each book. I just don't want this video to be super long, so I'll leave those videos linked down below. But I did enjoy this one, and I gave it 5 stars. The next fantasy book that I really enjoyed and was one of my favorites of the years was also one of my biggest disappointments, and that's really weird to say, but it's Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. I loved this book so much, and I was like, yes, I'm so glad that it's a series, because something that I've discovered about myself this year is I love when a fantasy is a series. Like I want to take a journey. I don't want to just read one book and be done. Like I want to go on the journey. And for me, I picked up this book the same year that it was concluded, like the series was concluded, so that was an even bigger plus, because I was like, I can just read the series straight through. I don't have to wait for any of the books to be released. And I picked this up this year and loved it down. I say it's my biggest disappointment though, because I hated the way that book 3 ended the series. Absolutely hated it. It was so disconnected that it makes it really hard for me to recommend this series, because the way that it ends is such a big letdown. But I did love book 1, absolutely obsessed with book 1, and I gave it 5 stars. The next fantasy book I have is Daughters of the Merciful Deep by Leslie Penelope. I haven't heard too many people talk about this book, and I'm not really sure why. I don't know if maybe they just don't know that it exists, but this was an amazing fantasy. It's also like a historical fantasy, and I think that's why I loved it so much, because historical fiction obviously is my favorite genre. So it had like the best of both worlds for me. I love this book. We're following a young lady as she tries to save her town from being drowned. And she does so in a very magical way. I think I just loved like the magical elements of this book and the way the author describes everything. I felt like I could literally see it and feel it. I felt like I was in the book with our main character, and I absolutely loved it. I think I gave this one 4.5 stars. If you're into fantasy and you're into historical fiction, I think you will really enjoy this book. I think the marriage of the two genres were perfect, absolutely perfect in this book. And the last book I do own, but I was not about to dig through all my totes trying to dig it out. I have no clue where I put that book. I know it's in one of these like 12 totes of books that I have sitting here, but I'm not going through all those books to dig it out. And that is The Deep by River Solomon. I read that one earlier this year. I also did a reading vlog on that book, and I will leave it linked down below. 5 stars. 5 stars. That was my first time getting a taste of River Solomon's writing, and I instantly knew, like, yeah, this person is going to be one of my favorite all-time writers, like of all time. And I'm so glad that I picked that book up. 5 star. It is such a short book. It's about mommy watas, or mermaids, what we know as like mermaids today. It is like a historical fantasy as well. It's so, the title of it is perfect. It's such a deep book. It is something that you have to, I believe, like reread multiple times, and each time you reread it, you're going to find something new in that book. And I'm enthralled. I can't wait to do a reread of this book. I probably will reread this book like once a year, just because it's such a short book, but it packs like such a powerful punch. I absolutely love that book. If you want to know a better synopsis and how obsessed I was with that book when I read it, I was able to catch that on camera. I will leave that video linked down below for you. Those were all of my fantasy picks. Now we're going to get into the other category, which honestly is just poetry. I didn't realize that I read a lot of poetry, and when I was going through all of the books that I read this year, I realized a lot of the poetry that I read, I really enjoyed, and they were all young adult. So I do love me a good young adult. And so we'll go ahead and get through those, and then I will share with you guys my favorite book of 2024, which I'm sure if you've been watching my channel, then you already know what that book is. But for our poetry, we have 2 books by Jason Reynolds. Long Way Down. I read this book at the beginning of the year. I think it was like the 3rd or 4th book that I read this year. Loved it. I listened to it on audio, which I do recommend listening to it on audio. It's a very short audio read because, you know, there's not a lot of words on each page. It's literally poetry, but the way that it tells a story is absolutely amazing. I can't wait until my boys are old enough to read this book. This is definitely one I'm going to be saving to add to my kids' collection, but I gave this one 5 stars. And this was my first introduction to Jason Reynolds. And I was like, okay, I want to read more by this author. And I did already have a book on my shelf by him, and I ended up picking it up. It's called For Everyone by Jason Reynolds. Also gave this one 5 stars, read it here on my channel, and it literally made me cry real tears. This book is very short, and I think it has a strong message, but it does so it delivers that message in just like a very plain way. I think a lot of times writing can be beautiful when you fluff it up, you know, like someone like River Solomon, and also like the book The Deep by River Solomon. They were able to deliver that message in such a way, but it was written in a way that's very poetic at times, and like you kind of have to dig through and sift through the words to get the message. What I liked about Jason Reynolds is that he delivers it in a very plain way, where you don't have to work for it. It's kind of just given to you, but the impact is still there. And I think it just came to me like at a very good time. Like sometimes you just read books at the perfect time, like where you are in your life. And I read this literally at the perfect time for where I was at in my life. And it brought me to tears. It's not like a super wordy poetry book. It's not super deep. It's very direct and straight to the point. Like there's not a lot of fluff, you know, but it's so good because it hit me when I needed it to hit me. And I did end up getting a lot of these for my younger cousins and for some of my nieces and nephews. So I absolutely love this book. Jason got a lot of money for me this year. And then the last poetry book I have is The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. I have a few books by this author on my shelf, and I wanted to get at least one knocked off this year. So I picked this one up, and I'm so glad that I did. Much like Jason Reynolds with The Long Way Down, I just loved the story that it told. It was a very real story, and I think people from all different walks of life deserve to have their story told, deserve to be able to read something and see that story reflected, and to be able to identify with different people in books. That's how you create children who love to read, is when you're able to show them something that they can relate to. And this is a book that I think my younger self would have really enjoyed, and I think so many of my peers as kids would have really enjoyed. It was just a really good story. And it's not long at all. I also read this on audio, but again, it's written in poetry form, so there's not a lot of words on each page. But I loved it, absolutely loved it, and I did end up tabbing this book as well. I just loved it, and now that I'm going to be having a little girl, this is also going to be a book that I'm going to be saving so that she can read it later on in life, and hopefully it will have the same effect on her that it did on me. Those were all of the other books, which is honestly it was just poetry. But now we're going to get into literally my favorite book of 2024. And if you've been watching my channel, you know what that book is. Ironically enough, this was the very first book that I picked up in 2024. And all year I found myself waiting for something to take the cake, like waiting for something else to give me the feeling that this book gave me, or to like surpass that feeling, and it just never came. And it became like a game in my mind, like this is going to be the book that is going to beat out The Reformatory by Tanana Ryu. I really thought Daughter of Merciful Deep would do it for me. It didn't. And I found myself comparing every book that I read to this book, like not necessarily the plot or like the context of the book, but how that book was making me feel, because I knew after reading this literally the first book that I read this year, I knew this was going to be my favorite, and I just wanted to be proven wrong, I guess. I don't know why. I guess I just didn't want my favorite book of the year to be the very first book that I read of the year, but that's what ended up happening. This is 5 stars, literally my baby. I love this book so much. I have been watching everyone else read this book like later in the year, and I've been like on pins and needles trying to figure out like what did they think about this book, what were their feelings about this book. Not that it was going to change my feelings at all, but you know, like when something is your favorite book and you're just like, this is going to determine whether or not we can be friends. And that is so dramatic, okay? But the way you felt about this book, if you didn't like it, I'm side-eyeing you. And if you did like it, but I felt like you didn't like it enough, I'm also side-eyeing you. Obviously, reading is subjective and everyone is going to feel differently about books. But y'all, this book, I don't know what about this book made it so impactful for me, but this is going to be a book that I recommend for literally the rest of my life. I loved this book so much. I don't remember if I did a reading vlog on it. I don't think I did. I don't think like I did an in-depth reading vlog, because again, it was literally my first book of the year, and I'd started my channel at the beginning of this year, so I don't think I was really like in the groove of filming reading vlogs, which is a bummer. I wish I would have gotten like my reaction on reading this book. I remember giving my husband like a step-by-step report of everything that was happening in this book and the characters and how it was. I read this book both physically and on audio, and I'm pretty sure I read it 50-50. I ended up reading the second half of this physically because it wasn't being read fast enough for me on audio. Now I will say the audiobook is really good, and I love the accents that were given in the audiobook. I do recommend, because it is kind of a chunker and it is like a very heavy book. I know I'm saying that I love this book, I'm obsessed with it, and I am, but it does have like some heavy topics in it. So if that's something that you don't think you'd be able to read physically, I do recommend reading it on audio, because the audiobook experience was really good. I just got so caught up in it that I wanted to read it faster and in one sitting. I'm pretty sure I finished the second 50% of this book in like 1 to 2 sittings. Loved it. 10 out of 10 stars. Highly recommend. This was literally my favorite book of 2024. And if this wasn't your favorite book, if you didn't like it, that's okay. I won't hold it against you. I will be a little bitter for a little while, and I may side-eye you and all of your recommendations from here until eternity, but we can still be bookish friends, and that is okay. I don't believe this is YA, but the characters are all children in this book, and I feel like with guidance, this could be a really good book to read for a mature young adult. And I would love to like be the person to guide that young adult, like that young teenager, while reading this book, you know? I just know young Kayla would have ate this up. All right, guys, that's all I have for you. Those are my favorite books of 2024. I had a really good reading year. It's kind of a bummer that my favorite book of the year was the very first book that I read, because it kind of feels like everything just went downhill from there. It's like if you start off at the top, then everything is downhill from there. And I'm not saying that I didn't like any of the books that any of the other books that I read, but none of them came close to the feeling that this gave me. So I'm hoping that 2025, I can slow my roll, and that I won't find my favorite book of 2025 until like the mid portion or like the end. Because if not, the whole time you're going to be chasing your 5-star. You're going to be chasing your favorite book of the year. And if it's the first book, then it's just going to be like, oh, everything else is just so dim compared, you know? Let me know down in the comments below, what was your favorite book of 2025? Did you like any of the books that I mentioned in today's video? Thank you so much for staying. If you watched till the very end, please leave this emoji to let me know that you stayed until the very end. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video.